Welcome to Tales of the Bard. Step into a world where stories come alive and imagination knows no bounds. Join me as I weave enchanting tales reminiscent of the bards of old, sharing legends, myths, and original stories that will transport you to distant lands and forgotten times. The tension in the tavern was palpable as Jonty returned to his seat by the fire. The crowd was completely engrossed in the tale of Ronan's battle of wits against the shapeshifter, eager to hear how the young druid would take the next step in his dangerous plan. The bard let the silence linger for a moment longer before he began, his voice low and filled with intrigue. A night of shadows. The plan was set in motion, Jonty began, his fingers moving softly over the lute strings. Ronan knew that he needed more than just cunning and false messages to defeat the shapeshifter. He needed to confront her directly, to ensure she would never again be able to harm Lyra or the kingdom. Jonty's voice lowered, filled with anticipation. That night, under the cover of darkness, Ronan called upon his most trusted ally, Skryla, the ancient druidess who had watched over him and Lyra for so long. In her many forms, Skryla had seen more than any mortal could dream, and now Ronan needed her skills in the art of stealth and precision. The bard's fingers strummed a few quick, light notes as he described Skryla's transformation. Skryla had been following the shapeshifter for days, observing her every move in her silverhawk form, watching her from the skies, learning her patterns, and now she would take on another form, one that would allow her to confront the shapeshifter head-on. Jonty smiled as he continued. At Ronan's request, Skryla transformed into her spider form, a giant mystical creature capable of weaving webs of magical silk. Silk so strong that even the most powerful creatures could not break free from it. She was fast, silent, and deadly, and she knew exactly where the shapeshifter was hiding. The shapeshifter's confrontation. The bard's music shifted to a tense, creeping melody, reflecting the danger of the moment. Ronan followed Skryla through the winding halls of the castle, his steps soft and deliberate, his druid staff clutched tightly in his hand. Skryla, now in her spider form, had already reached the shapeshifter's quarters, and by the time Ronan arrived, she had done her work. Jonty's voice dropped to a whisper as he described the scene. When Ronan stepped into the room, he found the shapeshifter trapped in Skryla's web, her body wrapped so tightly in the shimmering enchanted silk that she could hardly breathe. Her eyes were wide with panic, her shape shifting between forms as she struggled in vain to escape. But the more she fought, the tighter the silk constricted around her, binding her with magic that could not be undone by her powers. The bard's fingers danced over the lute strings, playing a quick, almost frantic rhythm to mimic the shapeshifter's desperate struggle. Skryla's many legs moved gracefully over the web, her large, glowing eyes fixed on the shapeshifter, watching her every move. There was no escape, and the shapeshifter knew it. Ronan's ultimatum. Jonty's music slowed, becoming more deliberate as he described Ronan's next move. Ronan stepped forward, his face calm but filled with purpose. The shapeshifter's wild eyes turned to him, and though she was barely able to speak, her fear was evident. She knew she had been caught, and there was no way out. Jonty's voice took on a darker tone as he described Ronan's words. "I know who you are," Ronan said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I know what you've done. You came here to poison Lyra, to infiltrate the court, and to serve the Hagborn witches. But you failed. And now you will serve me." The bard's music grew more intense as Ronan laid out his plan. "You will send a message to your masters," Ronan continued, his voice cold. "A message that I will dictate. You will tell them what I want them to believe, and if you do, I will spare your life." Jonty paused for a moment, letting the weight of Ronan's ultimatum settle over the room. The shapeshifter's eyes narrowed, but she could do nothing to resist. Skryla's web was too strong, and her own powers were useless against the magic that held her. She had no choice but to comply. The shapeshifter's false message. The bard's music picked up in tempo, reflecting the swift, calculated moves that followed. With the shapeshifter immobilized, Ronan began to dictate the false message. He wove a story of confusion and misinformation, designed to lead the Hagborn witches into a trap. The shapeshifter, with no other options, sent the message as instructed, her voice shaking as she whispered the words into the ether, using the dark magic that linked her to her masters. Jonty's voice filled with quiet triumph as he continued. Ronan watched carefully, sensing the currents of magic as the message was carried away, deep into the night. He knew that the Hagborn would believe the lie. After all, the shapeshifter had been one of their most trusted agents, and now they would walk straight into Ronan's trap. A silent understanding. Jonty's music slowed once more, becoming softer and more contemplative. Once the message had been sent, Ronan turned to Skryla, who still watched the shapeshifter from the shadows, her spider form towering over the bound creature. There was no need for words. Ronan and Skryla shared a silent understanding. The shapeshifter had served her purpose, and now it was time to decide her fate. The bard's voice dropped to a near whisper as he described the final moments. Ronan looked down at the shapeshifter, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. "You will remain here," he said, his voice calm but firm, "bound by Skryla's silk until I decide what is to be done with you." Jonty's fingers played a final soft chord as he brought the scene to its conclusion. The shapeshifter, exhausted and defeated, could do nothing but nod weakly, her once defiant spirit broken. Ronan turned to leave, knowing that the next steps in his plan would soon unfold. Skryla, in her spider form, lingered a moment longer, ensuring that the web remained tight before silently slipping back into the shadows. Plan takes shape. The bard's voice filled with quiet satisfaction as he finished. And so the trap was set. The Hagborn witches would soon receive their false message, and the shapeshifter, bound and powerless, would remain in the castle, unable to cause any further harm. Ronan had turned the tables on his enemies, but the real battle was still to come. Jonty smiled as he strummed a final chord on his lute. The tavern was buzzing with curiosity as Jonty returned to his seat by the fire, sensing the unspoken question on everyone's mind. What false message would Ronan send to the Hagborn? The patrons leaned in closer, eager to hear how the young druid would deceive the dark witches, leading them into a trap of their own making. Jonty's lute hummed softly as he strummed a few slow, calculating notes, the kind that mirrored the cunning in Ronan's mind. With a smile, the bard began his tale, his voice low and filled with intrigue. The false message. Ronan knew that the Hagborn witches were both powerful and clever, Jonty began, his voice steady but layered with tension. They would not be easily deceived, and any message sent by the shapeshifter would have to be carefully crafted to gain their trust. But Ronan had already thought of this. He understood the way the witches worked, their hunger for power, their thirst for control, and he would use that against them. The bard's fingers moved lightly over the strings, playing a melody that mimicked the weaving of a web. The shapeshifter, bound in Skryla's magic silk, had no choice but to obey. With Ronan standing over her, his voice calm but commanding, she began to whisper the message into the currents of dark magic, sending it directly to her Hagborn masters. Jonty's eyes gleamed as he spoke the words of the false message. "My mistress Malgora," the shapeshifter began, her voice strained but clear. "I have done as you commanded. Lyra the princess has been poisoned and weakened just as you wished, but there is more. I have discovered a crucial vulnerability in the castle's defenses." The patrons shifted in their seats, hanging on every word. Jonty's voice dropped to a near whisper as he continued. "The king's forces are stretched thin," the shapeshifter said, repeating Ronan's carefully crafted lie. "They are preparing for a large-scale offensive against the western fortresses, believing that your armies are amassing there. The king himself plans to lead the charge in the coming days, leaving the castle and its defenses vulnerable." Jonty's fingers strummed a slow, deliberate chord, building the tension. The Hagborn, ever eager to strike when their enemies were at their weakest, would seize this information as an opportunity to attack the castle, believing it to be unprotected. The trap. The bard's music shifted to a darker, more ominous tone as he described the trap Ronan had laid. But of course it was all a ruse. There was no planned offensive in the west. The king's forces were not stretched thin, and the castle would not be left vulnerable. In fact, the opposite was true. Ronan had already spoken to the king, and they were preparing to reinforce the castle, fortifying it with both troops and magic, making it a stronghold against any Hagborn attack. Jonty smiled as he revealed the deeper layers of the plan. The false message was designed to lure the Hagborn witches into a trap. Believing that the castle would be defenseless, they would strike at the heart of the kingdom, bringing their forces to bear in a full-scale assault. But what they wouldn't know was that the castle would be ready for them, its defenses stronger than ever, its soldiers prepared, and Ronan himself waiting in the shadows with his druidic magic. The bard's fingers moved quickly over the lute strings, playing a more urgent, triumphant melody. And as the witches sent their forces to the castle, believing they were walking into an easy victory, Ronan and his allies would strike at them from within, catching them off guard, breaking their ranks, and turning their own deception against them, feeding on their greed. Jonty's voice filled with quiet satisfaction as he spoke of Ronan's understanding of the Hagborn's weaknesses. Ronan knew that the Hagborn witches, for all their cunning, were driven by greed and ambition. They would not be able to resist the opportunity to strike at the kingdom's heart, to cripple its defenses and claim victory for themselves. But in their eagerness, they would fall into Ronan's trap, walking straight into the jaws of defeat. The bard smiled as he continued. The shapeshifter, still bound in scryless silk, finished delivering the message, her voice trembling as she repeated Ronan's lies. The message was sent, carried by dark magic to the Hagborn coven, where the witches would eagerly seize upon the false information. Jonty's music grew lighter, filled with quiet triumph. Ronan stood back, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The trap was set, and now all he had to do was wait. The Hagborn witches, unaware that they had been deceived, would soon make their move, and when they did, Ronan would be ready. The shapeshifter's fate. The bard's voice grew softer as he described the aftermath. With the message sent, Ronan turned to the shapeshifter, still bound tightly in Skryla's web. She had served her purpose, and now it was time to decide her fate. But Ronan was not without mercy. Though she had poisoned Lyra and deceived the court, he knew that the shapeshifter was just a pawn in a much larger game, a tool used by the Hagborn witches. Jonty's fingers plucked a slow, mournful melody as he continued. Ronan knelt beside her, his voice soft but firm. "You have served your purpose," he said, his eyes filled with quiet intensity. "And now you will remain here under my watch until we decide what is to be done with you." The bard's voice took on a darker tone as he described the shapeshifter's response. The shapeshifter, exhausted and defeated, could only nod weakly, her body trembling beneath the weight of the silk that bound her. She knew that her fate was now in Ronan's hands. The waiting game. Jonty's music slowed, reflecting the calm before the storm. And so, Ronan waited. The message had been sent, the Hagborn witches were being drawn into the trap, and the shapeshifter remained under Skryla's watchful eye. Now it was only a matter of time before the witches made their move, and when they did, Ronan would be there, ready to turn the tide of the war. The bard smiled as he strummed a final chord, his voice filled with quiet triumph. For Ronan, this was not just a victory of deception, it was the beginning of a much larger plan. A plan to outwit the Hagborn witches, to turn their own dark magic against them, and to protect the kingdom from the shadows that sought to destroy it. The tavern was silent as Jonty finished, the tension of the story still hanging in the air. The patrons, caught up in the cunning and danger of Ronan's plan, sat in quiet admiration for the young druid's cleverness. The false message had been sent, and now all that remained was to see how the Hagborn would respond. With a final bow, Jonty left the tavern, leaving behind a room full of eager listeners, all waiting to hear the outcome of the trap Ronan had so carefully set. The tavern was packed that evening, the air thick with excitement as Jonty took his place by the fire. Everyone knew that tonight's tale would reveal the next part of Ronan's daring plan to defeat the Hagborn witches. The false message had been sent, and now the entire room was eager to know what would happen when the trap finally sprang. Jonty let the anticipation build, his fingers resting lightly on the strings of his lute before he began, the calm before the storm. Ronan had set his trap, Jonty began, his voice low and steady, filled with tension. The false message, crafted with careful precision, had been sent to the Hagborn witches, and now all that remained was to wait. The kingdom appeared vulnerable, its defenses seemingly weakened, and the Hagborn, driven by their greed and thirst for power, believed that this was their moment to strike. Jonty's fingers moved softly over the lute strings, playing a slow, deliberate melody that mirrored the quiet before a storm. But the castle was far from defenseless. While the Hagborn witches prepared their forces, Ronan and the king had fortified the castle's walls with both soldiers and magic. The Paladins of the Sacred Flame, led by Sir Aldrich Dawnshield, stood ready in the courtyard, their weapons glowing with holy light. The dwarves, led by Thrain Ironhammer, had brought their siege engines, and the elven mages had woven spells of protection around the battlements. The bard's voice grew more intense as he described the preparations. Ronan himself had strengthened the land with his druidic magic, calling upon the power of the Blue Tree Network to weave protective enchantments into the very soil beneath their feet. Skryla, ever watchful, stood in her spider form, ready to strike from the shadows. Jonty smiled as he spoke of the calm before the storm. The stage was set, the trap was laid. All they had to do now was wait for the Hagborn to make their move. The Hagborn strike. The bard's music shifted, becoming darker and more urgent as he described the moment when the trap began to spring. As night fell over the castle, a deep, unnatural mist began to roll in from the west. It crept across the fields, swallowing the land in shadow, and with it came the Hagborn witches, their dark forms hidden within the swirling fog. Jonty's fingers danced over the lute strings, playing a haunting melody that echoed the witches' arrival. They came in silence, their magic spreading across the battlefield like a plague. The Hagborn's forces were vast. Gore fiends, vicious creatures summoned from the underworld, marched at their command, their eyes glowing with the fires of hell. Shadowy wraiths flitted through the mist, their ethereal forms slipping in and out of reality. And at the head of it all was Malgora, the twisted leader of the Hagborn coven, her eyes burning with dark power. The patrons leaned in closer as Jonty continued, his voice filled with the weight of the moment. The Hagborn believed the castle to be defenseless, just as the false message had told them. They expected an easy victory, a swift strike that would cripple the kingdom. But as they approached the walls, they were met with something they hadn't anticipated: resistance. The trap springs Jonty's music picked up in tempo, filled with urgency and action as the trap finally sprang. As the first wave of gore fiends charged toward the castle, the ground beneath them suddenly shifted. Ronan's druidic magic, woven into the earth itself, erupted from the soil, ensnaring the creatures in thick roots and vines. The gore fiends screeched and howled as the enchanted roots pulled them back, crushing them with the force of nature. The bard's fingers moved quickly over the strings, reflecting the chaos of battle. At the same moment, the Paladins of the Sacred Flame emerged from the courtyard, their weapons blazing with holy fire. Led by Sir Aldrich, they charged into the mist, their light cutting through the darkness, striking down the wraiths that flitted through the fog. The dwarves, with their mighty siege engines, launched flaming projectiles into the enemy ranks, scattering the Hagborn forces and breaking their momentum. Jonty's voice grew more intense as he described the battle's turning point. The Hagborn witches, caught off guard by the castle's sudden defenses, hesitated for the first time. They had expected weakness, but instead they found strength, and in that moment of hesitation, Ronan struck. Ronan's final move. The bard's music shifted, growing softer but filled with tension as he described Ronan's role in the battle. While the battle raged on the ground, Ronan stood atop the castle walls, his druid staff glowing with the power of the blue trees. He had been waiting for this moment, watching as the Hagborn forces moved into position, waiting for the perfect time to unleash his final move. Jonty's voice filled with quiet triumph as he described Ronan's strategy. With a single motion, Ronan called upon the full power of the Blue Tree Network, summoning the natural forces of the land to his aid. The air around him shimmered with magic, as the trees that surrounded the castle began to stir, their branches twisting and growing, their roots reaching out like giant hands. The bard smiled as he spoke of the final blow. The Hagborn witches, caught in the web of Ronan's magic, were suddenly surrounded. The tree's roots surged from the ground, wrapping around the witches and their minions, trapping them in place. The wraiths, once swift and elusive, were pulled into the earth by the enchanted roots, their forms dissipating like smoke. The gore fiends, unable to break free, were crushed beneath the weight of the trees. Jonty's voice dropped to a near whisper as he described the moment when Malgora realized she had been defeated. Malgora, the leader of the Hagborn, struggled against the magic that bound her. She tried to summon her dark powers, but it was too late. Ronan's magic was too strong, the power of the blue trees too ancient and too pure for her twisted sorcery to overcome. The battle's end. Jonty's music softened, reflecting the end of the battle and the calm that followed. As the last of the Hagborn forces were defeated, the mist began to lift, revealing the full scope of Ronan's victory. The castle stood strong, its walls unbroken, and the soldiers who had fought so bravely stood triumphant. The Hagborn, once so confident in their plan, had been utterly defeated, their forces scattered, their magic shattered. The bard smiled as he described the aftermath. Ronan descended from the walls, his staff still glowing with the power of the land. The king met him in the courtyard, his face filled with relief and gratitude. "You have done it," the king said, his voice thick with emotion. "The Hagborn are defeated." Jonty's fingers played a final triumphant chord as he brought the tale to its conclusion. But Ronan, ever the druid, knew that this victory was only one step in a much larger battle. The Hagborn witches, though defeated, were not gone for good. Malgora had escaped, retreating into the shadows, and Ronan knew that she would not rest until she had regained her strength. The bard's voice filled with quiet determination as he finished. But for now the kingdom was safe, and Ronan's trap had sprung perfectly. The Hagborn had been outwitted, their forces broken, and the kingdom stood strong once more. The tavern erupted into applause as Jonty finished, the excitement of the battle still fresh in the minds of the patrons. Ronan's plan had worked, and the Hagborn had been dealt a crushing blow, but the threat was far from over. There was more to come, more dangers to face, and the audience knew that the story of Ronan, Lyra, and the kingdom's fight against the dark forces was far from finished. With a final bow and a smile, Jonty left the tavern, leaving behind a room full of eager listeners, already looking forward to the next chapter in the epic tale.